The morning sun streamed through the grand windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat with her morning tea, reviewing her schedule for the day. William had left early for a royal engagement, and the children were still asleep upstairs. The peaceful quiet of dawn was broken by the sharp ring of William's private phone. Catherine watched her husband's face change as he answered the call. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hand gripped the phone tighter. She had seen that look before, but never quite like this. William's voice cracked as he spoke in hushed tones, stepping away toward the window overlooking the palace gardens. When he turned back to face her, Catherine knew their world had shifted forever. The man who had learned to carry the weight of a future crown on his shoulders, who had faced public scrutiny and personal loss with dignity, now looked like the young boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin years ago. "It's Queen Elizabeth," William whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's gone." The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. Catherine felt her own breath catch in her throat. The woman who had been the cornerstone of their family, the nation's beloved monarch for over 70 years, had passed peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Catherine moved to her husband's side, taking his trembling hand in hers. They stood together in silence, both understanding that this moment marked not just personal grief but the end of an era. William was no longer just the Duke of Cambridge. He was now the heir apparent, the Prince of Wales, next in line to inherit a responsibility that had seemed distant despite its inevitability. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and urgent preparations. Palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, their faces solemn as they began implementing protocols that had been planned for years but never truly expected to be needed. Catherine watched as William transformed before her eyes, setting aside his grief to step into his new role, even as she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were gently woken and told the news that would change their lives forever. Catherine held Charlotte close as the little girl tried to understand why everyone was crying, while George, old enough to grasp the magnitude of the moment, stood solemnly beside his father. As reports began to surface on television and social media, the reality of their loss began to sink in across the nation. The Queen, who had been a constant presence in British life for generations, was truly gone. For William and Catherine, however, this wasn't just the loss of a monarch, it was the loss of a grandmother, a mentor, and a woman who had quietly guided them through the complexities of royal life with wisdom and grace. That evening, as they prepared to travel to Balmoral to be with the family, Catherine watched William stare out at the London skyline. The city lights twinkled below, but she knew his mind was elsewhere, perhaps remembering quiet moments with his grandmother, or contemplating the enormous responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. The woman who had promised to serve her people until her dying day had kept that promise, and now it fell to the next generation to carry on her legacy. As Catherine packed their belongings for what would be one of the most difficult journeys of their lives, she understood that their private grief would soon become a public mourning, shared with millions who had loved the Queen from afar. The phone continued to ring throughout the night, bringing messages of condolence from world leaders and family members scattered across the globe. But in the quiet moments between the chaos, William and Catherine clung to each other, knowing that their strength would need to sustain not just their own family, but an entire nation preparing to say goodbye to the only monarch most had ever known. Tomorrow would bring the formal announcements, the ceremonial duties, and the beginning of a farewell that would capture the world's attention. But tonight, in the privacy of their home, they mourned as a family, holding tight to memories of Sunday lunches at Windsor, Christmas celebrations at Sandringham, and countless small moments that had woven the Queen's love and guidance into the fabric of their lives. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them both, but Catherine knew that together, they would find the strength to honor the Queen's memory while supporting each other through the darkest days that lay ahead. The woman who had shown them what duty and service truly meant deserved nothing less than their very best, even as their hearts broke with the magnitude of their loss. The helicopter blades cut through the Scottish morning air as William and Catherine made their way to Balmoral Castle. Below them, the rolling hills and ancient forests stretched endlessly, the same landscape the Queen had loved so dearly during her final years. Catherine reached for William's hand as they flew over the countryside, both lost in their own thoughts about the woman who would never again walk through those beloved halls. Upon landing at Balmoral, They were greeted by other members of the royal family who had made similar journeys throughout the night. King Charles, now bearing the weight of the crown, embraced his son with tears in his eyes. Catherine watched as 3 generations of men who would shape Britain's future stood together in their grief, united by loss but divided by the different ways they processed their pain. The castle felt different somehow, as if the very walls understood that their most cherished inhabitant was gone. Catherine walked through rooms filled with decades of memories, her footsteps echoing in hallways where the Queen's laughter had once filled every corner. Photographs lined the mantelpieces, showing a lifetime of service, family gatherings, and moments of pure joy that the public rarely saw. Prince Harry arrived later that afternoon, having traveled alone from California. The reunion between the brothers was tense yet tender, their personal differences temporarily set aside in the face of their shared grief. Catherine watched from a distance as William and Harry stood together on the same grounds where they had played as children under their grandmother's watchful eye. The Queen's final resting place was prepared with meticulous care, every detail reflecting her wishes and the traditions she had upheld throughout her remarkable reign. Catherine found herself thinking about the countless conversations she had shared with the Queen, the gentle advice offered during afternoon tea, and the way Her Majesty's eyes would light up when speaking about her great-grandchildren. As evening fell, the family gathered for a private dinner, sharing stories and memories of the woman who had shaped all their lives. William spoke about his grandmother's incredible sense of duty, how she had continued working until just days before her death, meeting with government officials and maintaining her correspondence with characteristic determination. Catherine shared her own memories of their wedding day, how the Queen had quietly reassured her during moments of nervousness, offering small gestures of support that meant everything to a young woman marrying into the most famous family in the world. Charlotte and George listened intently as adults spoke about their gangan, trying to understand the magnitude of the loss through stories that painted pictures of a woman who was both a queen and a beloved family matriarch. The next morning brought the beginning of formal ceremonies that would extend over the coming days. Palace officials worked around the clock to coordinate what would become one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in modern history. Catherine watched as William balanced his personal grief with his new responsibilities, making decisions about funeral arrangements while struggling with his own emotions. The Queen's body was prepared for the journey back to London, where millions would line the streets to pay their respects. Catherine helped coordinate the children's involvement in the ceremonies, knowing that their presence would provide comfort to a grieving nation while ensuring they could properly say goodbye to their great-grandmother. Phone calls poured in from around the world as heads of state expressed their condolences and confirmed their attendance at the funeral. Catherine marveled at the global impact of the Queen's death, realizing that their private family loss was being felt by people in every corner of the earth who had never met her but had been touched by her decades of service. In quiet moments, Catherine and William walked through the Queen's private gardens at Balmoral, remembering summer visits and the way she would point out different flowers and plants, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. These peaceful interludes provided brief respite from the overwhelming responsibilities that demanded their attention. The practical aspects of royal succession moved forward with precision, but Catherine could see the emotional toll on William as he prepared to take on new titles and duties while still processing his grief. She made sure he ate regular meals and took moments to rest, knowing that the coming weeks would test his strength in ways he had never experienced. As they prepared to leave Balmoral for the final time with the Queen, Catherine took one last look at the castle that had been her sanctuary. The mountains stood as silent witnesses to decades of royal history, and she knew that this place would forever hold special significance for their family. The journey back to London would mark the beginning of a public farewell that would capture the world's attention. But here in Scotland, surrounded by the landscapes the Queen had cherished, they had been able to grieve as a family, sharing memories and finding strength in each other before facing the enormous task of helping a nation say goodbye to the only monarch most had ever known. The gates of Buckingham Palace had become a shrine overnight. Catherine stood at the window of their London residence, watching as thousands of people streamed past, leaving flowers, photographs, handwritten letters, and treasured mementos. The sea of colorful bouquets stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to the deep affection the British people felt for their Queen. William joined her at the window, both of them overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from complete strangers. Children clutched handmade drawings of the Queen. Elderly couples shared memories of her coronation, and young families explained to their children why everyone was crying. The diversity of mourners reflected the Queen's ability to connect with people from all walks of life, regardless of age, background, or circumstance. Catherine suggested they walk among the crowds, and despite security concerns, William agreed. They needed to see for themselves how the nation was responding to their loss. As they stepped through the palace gates, a hush fell over the gathered mourners. People reached out tentatively, offering condolences and sharing brief stories about what the Queen had meant to them. An elderly woman approached Catherine with tears streaming down her face, explaining how she had waited outside the palace on the day of William and Catherine's wedding, just hoping to catch a glimpse of the Queen's joy. A young father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could hand William a drawing of the Queen, surrounded by her beloved corgis, the child's innocent gesture bringing tears to the prince's eyes. The queue to see the Queen lying in state stretched for miles through London, snaking along the Thames and through historic neighborhoods. Catherine marveled at the patience and determination of people who waited for over 12 hours, often in cold and rain, just to spend a few moments paying their respects. Families brought camping chairs and thermos flasks. Strangers shared sandwiches and stories, creating an impromptu community united by grief and love. Television coverage showed similar scenes across the Commonwealth, with people gathering at British embassies and high commissions around the world. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, flags flew at half-mast while citizens shared their own memories of royal visits and the Queen's role in their national identities. Catherine watched reports from Jamaica, where despite complex historical relationships, people spoke warmly of the Queen's personal kindness during her visits. The children struggled to understand why so many people were sad about someone they had never met personally. Catherine and William took time to explain how their great-grandmother had been like a mother to the entire nation, someone who had been there for people's happiest and most difficult moments throughout her long reign. George, Charlotte, and Louis listened carefully, beginning to grasp the unique role their family played in other people's lives. Messages of condolence arrived from world leaders, but it was the personal letters from ordinary citizens that moved Catherine most deeply. A nurse wrote about how the Queen's visit to her hospital had inspired her career, while a teacher described showing her students footage of the coronation every year to teach them about history and service. These individual stories painted a picture of a monarch who had touched millions of lives through small acts of attention and care. Catherine coordinated with palace staff to ensure that as many mourners as possible could participate in the farewell ceremonies. She insisted that spaces be reserved for healthcare workers, teachers, and volunteers, the everyday heroes the Queen had championed throughout her reign. William supported these decisions, knowing his grandmother would have wanted her funeral to reflect the diversity and dedication of the people she had served. The international response surprised even seasoned palace officials. Presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs from around the world confirmed their attendance, creating unprecedented security and logistical challenges. Catherine worked closely with diplomatic teams to ensure that every detail honored both the Queen's memory and the relationships she had built with world leaders over 7 decades. In Westminster Hall, where the Queen lay in state, Catherine observed the profound silence that fell over visitors as they approached the coffin. People from all backgrounds, soldiers in uniform, families with young children, elderly survivors of World War II, stood together in respectful quiet, many wiping away tears as they paid their final respects. The media coverage was constant but respectful, with journalists sharing stories about the Queen's wit, her dedication to duty, and the way she had modernized the monarchy while maintaining its essential traditions. Catherine appreciated how reporters focused on celebrating the Queen's life rather than sensationalizing the family's grief. Understanding that this moment belonged to the entire nation, as the funeral approached, Catherine found herself thinking about the weight of expectation on William's shoulders. Not only was he grieving the loss of his grandmother, but he was also stepping into a role that would define the rest of his life. She made sure their children understood that while this was a sad time, it was also an opportunity to honor their great-grandmother's memory by continuing her commitment to serving others. The final preparations were intense, with every detail scrutinized to ensure the ceremony would be worthy of the Queen's remarkable legacy. Catherine reviewed seating arrangements, timing schedules, and protocol requirements, all while managing her own emotions and supporting her family through their grief. The world watched as London prepared for what would be remembered as one of the most significant funerals in modern history. But for Catherine and William, it remained deeply personal, a final goodbye to a woman who had guided them with wisdom, love, and an unwavering commitment to duty that would inspire them for the rest of their lives. The morning of the funeral dawned crisp and clear, as if nature itself was showing respect for the momentous day ahead. Catherine woke early, her mind already focused on the countless details that would need to come together perfectly to honor the Queen's memory. She looked over at William, who had barely slept, his face etched with the weight of grief and responsibility that this day would bring. Getting the children ready proved to be an emotional challenge. George, now understanding the significance of the day, stood solemnly as his formal attire was adjusted. Charlotte clung to Catherine's hand, asking quiet questions about what would happen, while young Louis seemed to sense the gravity of the occasion despite his age. Catherine knelt down to speak with each of them, explaining that today was their chance to show the world how much they loved their Gangan. The journey to Westminster Abbey was unlike anything London had ever seen. The streets were lined with people 10 deep, many having stood there since the early hours of morning. Catherine watched through the car window as faces young and old gazed solemnly at their procession, many holding photographs of the Queen or small Union Jack flags. The silence was profound. A city of millions had fallen quiet to honor one remarkable woman. Inside Westminster Abbey, Catherine was struck by the gathering before them. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, all seated together in a display of respect that transcended political differences and international boundaries. She spotted familiar faces among the congregation, people from charities the Queen had supported, representatives from organizations she had championed, ordinary citizens who had been chosen to attend this extraordinary farewell. As the service began, Catherine found herself focusing on William's face, watching him struggle to maintain his composure as hymns filled the ancient abbey. His jaw tightened during readings that spoke of duty and service, words that had defined his grandmother's life and would now define his own. She reached for his hand, offering silent support as emotions threatened to overwhelm him. The Archbishop of Canterbury's words resonated through the abbey, speaking of a life dedicated to others, of promises kept and duties fulfilled. Catherine thought about the private conversations she had shared with the Queen, moments when the monarch had spoken about the weight of responsibility and the importance of putting others before oneself. These lessons had shaped not just William, but her own understanding of what it meant to serve. When the last post sounded, followed by 2 minutes of silence, Catherine felt the weight of history in the air. Across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth, millions of people stood in respectful quiet, united in their final tribute to the Queen. The silence was so complete that even the youngest members of the congregation seemed to understand its significance. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch was a masterpiece of military precision, but Catherine's attention remained focused on her family. She watched as William walked behind the gun carriage carrying his grandmother's coffin, his face a mask of controlled grief. King Charles, despite his own sorrow, led the procession with dignity, understanding that the nation needed to see strength in their darkest hour. George and Charlotte stood with their parents during the ceremony, their behavior impeccable despite the overwhelming nature of the occasion. Catherine was proud of how they conducted themselves, showing maturity beyond their years while still being allowed to grieve as children. Their presence provided comfort to many who watched, a reminder that the Queen's legacy would continue. Through future generations, the moment when the Queen's coffin was loaded onto the state hearse for the final journey to Windsor Castle marked a transition that everyone could feel. The formal ceremony was ending, but the personal farewell was just beginning. Catherine knew that the most difficult part lay ahead, the private burial service where they would say goodbye not as representatives of the crown, but as a grieving family. Television audiences around the world watched as the hearse made its way through the streets of London and out into the countryside toward Windsor. People lined the motorways and country roads, throwing flowers and applauding as the Queen passed by one final time. Catherine was moved by these spontaneous displays of affection. understanding that they represented the genuine love people felt for the woman who had been a constant presence in their lives. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, the atmosphere became more intimate, despite the presence of dignitaries and family members from around the world. This was where the Queen had worshipped regularly, where she had attended countless family celebrations and ceremonies. The familiar surroundings made her absence feel even more profound, but also provided comfort to those who had shared these spaces with her. The committal service was brief but deeply moving, with prayers that spoke of a life well lived and service faithfully completed. Catherine watched as William placed his hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes about how the family was coming together in their grief. The sight of 3 generations of future monarchs supporting each other through this farewell provided reassurance to a nation wondering about its future. As the service concluded and the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault, Catherine felt a chapter of history closing. The woman who had been the bedrock of their family and the cornerstone of the nation was finally at rest. The magnitude of what lay ahead, for William, for their children, for the entire country, was overwhelming, but she knew they would face it together. The day had been a triumph of organization and emotion, a fitting farewell to a monarch who had dedicated her life to duty and service. As they prepared to leave Windsor Castle, Catherine looked back at the chapel where they had said their final goodbyes, knowing that this moment would remain with them forever, as they continued the Queen's work of serving others with dedication and grace. The days following the funeral brought an unexpected quiet to Kensington Palace, a stark contrast to the weeks of intense ceremony and public mourning. Catherine found William standing in their private study, staring at a photograph of the Queen with their children taken just months earlier at her Platinum Jubilee celebration. The image showed her laughing at something Louis had whispered in her ear, her eyes twinkling with the same mischief that had charmed world leaders and ordinary citizens alike. The children struggled with the sudden absence of their great-grandmother in different ways. George asked thoughtful questions about heaven and whether Gangan could still see them, while Charlotte created elaborate drawings of the Queen surrounded by angels and her beloved corgis. Louis, still young enough to expect her at family gatherings, would look toward her usual chair during meals, his confusion breaking Catherine's heart afresh each time. William began the difficult process of reading through condolence letters, a task that would take months to complete. Catherine often found him at his desk late into the evening, carefully considering responses to heartfelt messages from around the world. Some letters came from fellow monarchs and political leaders, but it was the personal notes from ordinary people that moved him most deeply. A letter from a young girl in Wales described how the Queen's visit to her school had inspired her to become a nurse, wanting to help others just as the Queen had helped her nation. Another came from a veteran who had served in the Falklands War, thanking the Queen for her support of military families and explaining how her letters to bereaved mothers had provided comfort during the darkest times. Catherine established new routines to help the family process their grief while maintaining their royal responsibilities. She arranged for quiet dinners where they could share memories without the pressure of public appearances, creating space for William to express emotions he felt unable to show in his official capacity as heir to the throne. The Queen's private apartments at Windsor Castle became a place of pilgrimage for family members seeking connection with her memory. Catherine often accompanied William on these visits, walking through rooms that remained exactly as the Queen had left them. Her reading glasses still sat on her desk beside correspondence she would never finish, while photographs of family celebrations covered every available surface. In the Queen's sitting room, Catherine discovered a small collection of handwritten notes the monarch had kept in a private drawer. They were brief observations about her great-grandchildren, George's thoughtful nature, Charlotte's artistic talents, Louis's infectious laughter. The Queen had been quietly documenting these precious moments, creating a record of love that brought both comfort and fresh waves of grief. William began incorporating lessons from his grandmother's approach to monarchy into his own evolving role as Prince of Wales. He studied her appointment diaries, marveling at her ability to balance state duties with personal interests, always finding time for the causes she cared about most deeply. Catherine watched him grow into this new responsibility, drawing strength from the Queen's example while developing his own leadership style. The international impact of the Queen's death continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Catherine received invitations to memorial services in Commonwealth countries, requests for her to visit communities that had been particularly touched by the Queen's legacy. Each invitation came with personal stories about how the Queen had influenced lives across continents and cultures. A particularly moving request came from a hospital in Canada where the Queen had visited during Catherine and William's tour years earlier. The staff wanted to establish a scholarship program in the Queen's memory, supporting young people who showed her same commitment to serving others. Catherine worked with palace officials to ensure the royal family's support for such initiatives, knowing the Queen would have been pleased to see her legacy living on through practical help for those in need. The changing seasons brought new challenges as traditional royal events continued. Without the Queen's presence, Catherine helped William navigate his first major state function as Prince of Wales, watching him struggle with taking his grandmother's place at ceremonies she had attended for decades. His nervousness was visible only to her, but she saw how he channeled his grief into determination to honor her memory through excellent service. Private family traditions became even more precious in the Queen's absence. Catherine made sure that Sunday roasts continued as they had when the Queen was alive, with similar conversations about current events and family news. She encouraged the children to share stories about their great-grandmother, keeping her memory alive through regular remembrance, rather than treating her as a forbidden topic. William's relationship with his father deepened during this period, as both men navigated new roles while processing shared grief. Catherine observed their conversations about duty and responsibility, seeing how King Charles passed on wisdom the Queen had shared with him decades earlier. The continuity of royal tradition provided comfort, even as it highlighted the enormous changes their family faced. The first Christmas without the Queen approached with particular difficulty. Catherine spent weeks planning celebrations that would honor her memory while allowing the family to grieve authentically. She incorporated traditions the Queen had loved, specific carols, favorite foods, and the exchange of small, thoughtful gifts rather than expensive presents. As winter settled over Britain, Catherine found herself thinking often about the Queen's final years and the grace with which she had faced aging and loss. The monarch had buried her husband, her mother, and her sister, yet had continued serving with dignity until her final days. This example of resilience in the face of sorrow provided a template for how Catherine and William might navigate their own journey through grief while maintaining their commitment to the people who depended on them. The way Queen's influence extended beyond official duties into the most personal aspects of their lives, and Catherine realized that healing would come not from forgetting their loss, but from transforming their love for her into continued service to others, carrying forward the values she had lived by until her very last breath. 1 year after the Queen's death, Catherine stood in the same palace garden where she had received the devastating phone call that changed their lives forever. The roses the Queen had loved were in full bloom, their fragrance carried on the gentle breeze that rustled through the ancient oak trees. William approached quietly, carrying a small bouquet of flowers the children had picked from their own garden at Kensington Palace. The anniversary brought a flood of memories and emotions, but also a recognition of how much their family had grown and changed in the face of profound loss. George had developed a deeper understanding of his future role, asking thoughtful questions about duty and service that reminded Catherine of his great-grandmother's wisdom. Charlotte had begun showing interest in the charities the Queen had supported, particularly those helping children and animals. William had transformed remarkably over the past year, growing into his role as Prince of Wales with a confidence that honored his grandmother's memory, while establishing his own approach to royal service. Catherine watched him during public engagements, seeing how he carried himself with the same grace and dignity the Queen had embodied, but with his own warmth and modern sensibility that connected with people of all ages. The charitable work they had undertaken in the Queen's memory had created unexpected connections around the world. Catherine received regular updates about scholarship programs, community centers, and healthcare initiatives established in honor of the Queen's legacy. Each project reflected her values of service, dedication, and putting others' needs before one's own comfort. A particularly meaningful development was the establishment of the Queen Elizabeth II Youth Leadership Program, which brought together young people from across the Commonwealth to learn about public service and community engagement. Catherine had worked closely with organizers to ensure the program reflected the Queen's belief that young people held the key to solving the world's challenges. The children had found their own ways to honor their great-grandmother's memory. George volunteered at a local food bank, understanding that helping others was the best way to show love for someone who was no longer physically present. Charlotte created artwork for charity auctions, while Louis, despite his young age, insisted on participating in family discussions about how they could continue the Queen's work. William's relationship with his father had evolved into a strong partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Catherine observed their conversations about modernizing the monarchy while maintaining its essential traditions, seeing how they balanced innovation with reverence for the Queen's example. The transition of power had been seamless, but the emotional adjustment continued to unfold gradually. The international relationships the Queen had cultivated over 7 decades required careful nurturing by the next generation. Catherine accompanied William on state visits where they met with leaders who had worked closely with the Queen, ensuring that diplomatic bonds remained strong while establishing their own connections. These trips often included visits to communities the Queen had touched during her travels, creating continuity between past and future. Private moments of remembrance became just as important as public ceremonies. Catherine established a tradition of reading the Queen's favorite poems to the children on significant anniversaries, while William shared stories about his grandmother's sense of humor and her ability to find joy in simple pleasures despite the weight of her responsibilities. The Queen's influence on their parenting became more apparent as time passed. Catherine found herself using phrases the Queen had employed when offering gentle guidance, while William demonstrated the same patient listening skills his grandmother had shown during their private conversations. These inherited traits provided comfort and connection across generations. Letters continued to arrive from around the world, many from people sharing how the Queen's example had inspired them to make positive changes in their own communities. A teacher in Australia wrote about establishing a mentorship program for disadvantaged students, while a group of nurses in Canada created a support network for healthcare workers facing difficult situations. Catherine realized that grief had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more positive, a determination to live up to the Queen's example while creating their own path forward. The pain of loss remained, but it was accompanied by pride in continuing her work and gratitude for the lessons she had taught them about resilience, service, and love. The annual memorial service at Westminster Abbey drew crowds that rivaled the funeral itself, demonstrating that public affection for the Queen had not diminished with time. Catherine watched as people of all ages participated in the ceremony, many bringing their children to learn about the remarkable woman who had shaped their nation for so many decades. As the service concluded, Catherine and William walked slowly through the crowds gathered outside the Abbey. People approached them with the same warmth and respect they had shown during those first difficult days after the Queen's death. But now there was also recognition of how the royal family had honored her memory through continued dedication to service. That evening, as Catherine tucked the children into bed, Charlotte asked if Gangan knew about all the good things they were doing to remember her. Catherine smiled, explaining that love never truly ends. It just changes form, continuing to inspire good works and kind actions long after someone has left this world. William joined her later in their private sitting room, where a portrait of the Queen with all her great-grandchildren held a place of honor. They sat together in comfortable silence, both understanding that while their grief would always be part of them, it had been transformed into something powerful and positive, a commitment to serve others with the same grace, dignity, and unwavering dedication that had defined the Queen's remarkable life. The legacy lived on not just in official ceremonies and charitable foundations, but in daily choices to put duty before personal comfort, to listen more than they spoke, and to remember that true leadership meant serving others rather than being served. In this way, the Queen's spirit continued to guide them, ensuring that her influence would shape generations yet to come.